Hey guys, welcome today for our next installment here. We're going to take a look at the causes of the Great Depression. So kind of moving forward now into our Unit 7, leaving the Roaring Twenties, and now we're going to see what challenges arise economically and socially for most Americans here during this time period. So let's go ahead and kind of bridge that gap. So remember we talked about the consumerism culture, the flapper culture that is starting to spread, especially in the large major cities during the 1920s, and it seems like everything's going well and that the economy is strong, and that is true. However, there are some building tensions that are happening during the 1920s that are not being addressed, some agriculturally, some as far as buying on credit and so forth. And the economy is not as strong as it once looked. And it will kind of culminate in October 1929 when the stock market crashes. So the first thing we're going to kind of go through is and look at the major causes of what brought the stock market to crash and eventually led to the beginning of the Great Depression. All right, so as we go through, we're going to look at a number of primary sources, whether they be graphs, pictures, all sorts of different sources to look at and try to best understand what is causing the Great Depression. The first one that we're going to look at here is a pie graph showing the distribution of wealth during this time period. And one of the things that John Green highlighted in the video that we watched on the Edpuzzle site was that the rise of income inequality, it really explodes during this time period. Now, as far as whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that can be argued, but one of the problems that we see is that, especially in the rural areas, there's a lot of abject poverty. At this point, at a rate of inflation, it took about 2,500 years. I'm sorry, about $2,500 to be considered above the poverty line, or to have what's considered a decent standard of living. And if we look at this pie graph, about 65, and then if you even include a piece of the blue graph here, let's just round up to say 70, about 70% of Americans did not make enough to live what we consider a decent standard of living. And a lot of them are living out in the Midwest, in the rural parts of states, because we talked about there was a completely different lifestyle for that between the rural and the urban Americans. So this is part of a problem that when the economy collapses, these people who make such little money is going to be negatively affected. So if we look at our next source here, I pull a cartoon from the time period. If we look here, we have somebody says a victim of bank failure here, but on the park bench sitting beside him, and Mr. Squirrel's talking to him, and he's saying, "But why didn't you save some money for the future when times were good?" And the man's saying, "I did." What this is referring to is that part of the problems was bank failures. That the idea of a bank, if you guys have your money in a bank now, which I'm sure most of you do, is that you create an account with them, a savings account and a checking account and so forth. And with your savings account, that money is going into the bank, and they're going to take that money and they're going to do investments and so forth to try to make themselves money. Well, the problem is that when they don't keep all of that cash on hand at every given moment. They only have so much finite cash on them at any given time. So if there is some sort of crisis, like let's say the stock market, where people are freaking out that they're going to lose their money and they want to pull their money out of the bank, well, when 90% of the people come clamoring for their money, the bank doesn't have it. So these banks are going to go under, they're going to basically fail because they don't have the cash flow that they need to be able to operate. That all these investments that they are investing in are turning belly up and they're not getting their money back, and therefore they're going to fail just like a business would. And guess what? When the bank fails, so do you, because your money was tied up into that bank. So for this cartoon, the gentleman saying, "I did save my money. I put it in a bank, and guess what? The bank lost my money. Therefore, now I'm broke." And that was a very real thing for many people during this time period, where they put their money in the stocks, they put the rest of their money in the banks, and then when the banks foreclose or when the banks close altogether, they no longer have any cash. So again, here we're going to see that stock prices are going to drop, and that during the Roaring Twenties, things were great, things were great, things were great, and then we're going to hit a big bubble. And this happens from time to time, and you can see that it will drop for the next 3 years, and it drops all the way down to 1932. And this is where the Depression comes in and kickstarts. And then FDR is going to try to rebound this, and we're going to find out that it doesn't work so well, or the way at least that he intended. But this is really kind of what people see as the beginning of the Depression, because this is where people felt it more economically across the country. As far as the agriculture sector of the economy that had already been struggling, but most Americans have not been seeing that problem. This is what brings attention to the depression. It's kind of where we think of it as the beginning of the depression here with the dropping of the stock market in October of 1929. Another major problem here, if we look at this graph, we've been talking about this for a number of weeks now, as far as the overproduction of agricultural goods or food. That during that time period, during the Gilded Age, the early part of the Gilded Age and Reconstruction, people were being enticed to move out westward. And what this creates is overproduction in states where farming is key, and this overproduction eventually leads to deflation, and people are losing their money, and they're being, unfortunately, they're not able to then pay back their loans on their mortgages for their farms, and they're turning belly up, and the banks are foreclosing on the farms. And you can see that this is steadily increasing all the way throughout the 1920s. That's why I said that although the depression, we kind of think of it happening with the stock market crash in 1929, that it's been felt by others beforehand. A lot of rural Americans are feeling the depression before, again, having a lower income rate than what meets the poverty line. So although we think of the stock market crash, things have been building beforehand. This is just another example. One of the things that they had benefited from beforehand was these economic policies called subsidies, where essentially the farmers were getting paid to continue to farm. So the government under the Progressive Era was spending money to keep farmers afloat, and by giving them money, so that way even if they lost money, they would be able to stay in business and keep producing crops. However, during the 1920s, one of the conservative policies, laissez-faire, would say we don't do that. We don't support businesses no matter what kind that they are, and they're going to stop those subsidies. And then you can see that a lot of these farmers are starting to be foreclosed on because they're not getting that extra subsistence from the federal government. So again, all this is a direct correlation from the overproduction and rates of technology increasing how much one farmer can supply, and the oversaturation of the supply market is causing farmers to lose out here because they're not able to compete, and there's just too much production, there's too much supply in the market for these farmers. Another cause here, if we look at this chart, it does a really good job of showing kind of what margin means. And I believe this is actually a practice that's illegal today. But what was happening a lot of times, a lot of people, average ordinary citizens, were getting involved in the stock market for the first time, and they're buying stocks on what's called margin. And what that essentially means is that you're kind of think of it like credit. You're not paying it all up front. You're hoping that you're going to be able to make enough profit to pay back then some for this. So what we're saying here, let's say you buy $1,000 worth of stock. Let's just say Apple, even though that's not a company in 1920, but let's say we're buying a stock of Apple on margin. You're going to pay $100 to your stockbroker, and they will cover the other 900, which means you essentially owe this money to your stockbroker. So now we take that buying stock on margin and we apply it to the first situation, which is, hey, things are going great. The economy is good, roaring 20s, it's booming. So Apple stock goes from, it rises in value, and our $1,000 worth of stock is now being sold for $1,500. So we sell it. What that essentially means is that we sold it for $1,500. Well, we gave $900 back to the stockbroker who we owed, and now we walk away with a $600 profit. The problem is that when this happens in occurrence and the stock market loses money, or when your stock decreases in value and you sell, now you lose, and you owe your stockbroker money that you don't have. And this is going to be part of the problem. That's why, like I said, I believe this practice is illegal. We can look this up in class. I don't believe you can buy stuff on margin anymore. You have to pay for it in cash up front. But what a lot of people were doing is they were buying stuff on margin and just anticipating that the market will continue to rise and rise and rise like it had throughout the 1920s. Well, when it crashes, now you've taken a hit, you've taken a loss, because now you have to pay back the stockbroker and your stock had lost value. One of the other causes is that people were in debt for the first time really in history, that at least this much debt, and this is even the case still today, that debt is a huge problem for people, whether it be on credit, whether it be in mortgages and car loans and so forth. Well, this is the same case here. You can see how just from the 1929 to 1921 to 1929, I'm sorry, the average debt rises almost $6,000, and people are buying more stuff on credit. They're not paying for it up front. So guess what? Again, when there's a little snag in the economy, now you're not able to pay back what you anticipated being able to in the past. So people are not saving as much. They're not prepped in case something bad takes place, or if they lose their job, they're really screwed because they're living paycheck to paycheck. Companies are also going to contribute to this in the fact that they overconsume or they overproduce. During the 1920s, remember, there's a huge influx of new technologies that people are buying. Well, somebody can only buy so many toasters or so many cars or so many vacuum cleaners. And part of the problem is that these goods are being overproduced. And as a business, eventually what then you produce them and then nobody can buy them because they've already bought them. And you have nobody to sell them to and you lose money. And this will also become a problem as far as trying to find the perfect margin or the perfect marketplace. Consumer or producers, I'm sorry, are still trying to figure out how much to consume or how much to produce for the new society or the new kind of way of life here during the 1920s, because you want to try to maximize your profit by finding the perfect amount of supply and demand. One of the things too, and this is kind of contributing to the rise of the farming depression, is that at the end of World War I, all that food that was being produced or that was being bought by the federal government to send overseas to the troops is no longer needed. So we're going to see a huge decline in crop prices, and again leading to deflation and leading to more foreclosures on farms. So just to take a look here, and I thought this was interesting as far as how does the debt of 1920s compare to the debt of today in the 2000s? And you can see here that the average person in 1929 was saving about $1,600 a year and had an average debt of about $10,000. If we compare that to, or you can see kind of what their debt looks like as well as far as credit cards and as far as mortgages. However, if we compare that to today, in 2008, when the recession took place, the average person was saving less than $500 a year, and he had huge amounts of debt. The average debt was over 118,000 or almost 118,000, and a huge bulk of that being mortgages, and that's why the housing crisis took place and the housing bubble burst essentially, and a lot of people lost their homes and were foreclosed on, and huge amounts of credit card and installment loans. We already kind of mentioned that uneven distribution of wealth. So even though as the gap divides and becomes poor or becomes bigger and bigger, we see that about 70% of Americans were considered poor during this time period. And again, a lot of that happening in rural America. And what this eventually leads to is a stock market speculation. Again, the buying on margin, and then when the market crashes, you're SOL because you no longer have the money to pay back your stockbrokers. And this kind of it creates what's called a bubble in the stock market, and it will eventually lead to the stock market crashing in October of 1929 on the 29th of the month. And people will lose thousands and thousands of dollars, and some will lose their entire savings. And again, the banks will fail because when people then clamor to try to get the last bit of money they have out of the banks don't have the money. They cannot produce the money that they need. And these banks are going to fail and people are going to lose their life savings. And eventually this will lead to then thousands of businesses collapsing as well because they cannot produce or they cannot afford to produce the goods they need. So it's important to keep in mind that there's not just one single factor. There's a multitude of factors kind of culminating together and tying together, whether it be the farming crisis, whether it be the stock market bubble and buying on margin, or the idea of debt and people just not having as much cash as they need to survive. So all these things are kind of running together, and it will culminate with the stock market crash. And when it begins, unemployment rises so quickly because people are losing their jobs because businesses cannot afford to keep them. They cannot afford to hire them. They're having to make pay cuts, or they're having to take pay cuts just to keep their jobs. And you can see that unemployment goes from about 1.5 million to over 12 million in just a span of 4 to 5 years. So there's a lot of people here, and you can see the resentment, and you can see the anger and frustration here, and just the kids' protest signs like, "Why can't you give my dad a job?" Because these businesses cannot afford to in most instances. And then the problem really becomes cyclical because as people are having less money to spend, businesses are making less money, and therefore they can't hire as many workers. And you can see how it almost becomes a circle or a chicken and the egg situation with which is worse or which comes first. And, is it because the people are losing their jobs that they can't spend, or is it because the businesses can't afford to hire them? And therefore we start from there. So all these things are kind of culminating and creating this atmosphere of depression.